So our next panel session is on healthcare DPG deployment. And the question is, should we host locally or on the cloud? And we have three panelists. Our first panelist is Pradipta Kundu, the director of eGov. Pradipta Kundu, welcome. And then we have Fidelis Suwedi, the Senior Technical Advisor, Digital Health at Clinton Health Access Initiative, CHAI, I suppose. Welcome, Fidelis. And lastly, we have Tom Olwatch, the co-founder and chairman at Kenya Health Informatics Association. Welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for being with us today. Sorry for taking your chair. So I think we will begin by having the panel introduce themselves and the work that you do and what the organization you're in does in light of health and health data, whichever one, or health policy in that space. And then perhaps just so that we are on the same page with everyone in the room, to tell us or to talk about what is on cloud and what is, so that we are on the same page and we're not losing anyone. So just talk slightly about that.
Hello, everybody. I'm Pradipta, and I'm a technologist in, in how many women technologists are out there in this room? Oh my God! Hopefully, we'll see more soon. So yeah, I'm a software. I'm an engineer by profession, software engineer for now 25 years. And for the last 10 plus years, I've been working in the intersection of using digital technologies to solve problems in health, right? And there's a long way to go. I'm just scratching the surface. I work for an organization called eGovernments Foundation, and we work with governments. We partner with them in large-scale digital transformations. We've been around, and if any of you would listen to my colleague, Gautam, he was on the panel as well yesterday. So we provide technology, policies, support, and guidance on how governments can use technology to provide better services to its people. Coming to your last question on what, and I think that's a very good question because that can be quite confusing. So I have seen three types of definitions about cloud. One is what's called an on-prem. It can sometimes also be called a government cloud, right? Which is the government owned data center where systems are hosted. The other is a service provider within the country who is probably, or regionally, who's providing a cloud solution. But the other is a commercial cloud, which are the large, the ones that we are all aware of, which is Amazon, Microsoft, Google clouds. So sometimes we sort of can tend to, mix all of them together.
So you're saying we can have a public cloud, quote unquote, and a private cloud that is within the organization.
Yes, yes.
Let's come to you next, Fidelis.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks for having me. For those that were not here yesterday, I'll introduce myself. I'm Fidelis Suwedi, and I'm working with Clinton Health Access Initiative. So basically, my role is to provide technological advisory on assessment of products, implementation of products, and also how those products are hosted and how they're used. So I'm from Malawi, and for most part, I've been supporting the Ministry of Health in the design and development of electronic medical records. I've also supported other systems from child protection solutions, e-learning solutions. I I think to answer the second question on cloud hosting versus local hosting, I think for local hosting, it's when you have your solutions being hosted on physical servers that are within your premises, mostly. And this is actually has been a common approach, particularly in most of the African countries. And then we also have some data centers that are within the countries, and then we also have some data centers that are elsewhere that you don't even know where they are, and that's now where we're talking about cloud hosting. And usually this comes as a service, so you generally just have to buy the hosting space as a service. So you have infrastructure as a service, sometimes you even have software as a service. So I think some of the other things my colleague has already pointed them out.
Thanks, Fidelis. Mr. Wu.
Yes. Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope this is working. Yeah, so my name is Tom Oluoch. My day job, I work for CDC. I'm based here in Rwanda. I've been here the last year and a half or so. My primary work, I work closely with the Ministry of Health here and the Rwanda Biomedical Center to support their digital transformation agenda, which, as Noella mentioned when she was here, I think Rwanda is really one of those countries that really has a strong vision about digitalization of government services. And as CDC, we support that agenda within the health domain. So that's what I do on my day job. I do one or two other things, as you've just shown up there. We established the Kenya Health Informatics Association with a group of colleagues about 10 years ago. And I was the founding chairperson. It's basically a professional association that aims to bring together different practitioners or people who are in the health informatics domain, whether they are clinicians or public health practitioners, computer scientists, guys in academia, development, partners, and so on, with the purpose of best practice for health informatics. And then the third hat that I wear is the Health Informatics in Africa, which is an African-wide, Pan-African association for health informatics. It's also a professional association. And it's the African regional representation of the International Medical Informatics Association. So I'm the immediate past president, and currently serve on the advisory council. So to your question, I think my two colleagues have pretty much described what local hosting is versus cloud-based hosting. And I think the only thing I would add to what they've said is the levels of responsibility. Because in local hosting, you are charged as an organization with all the infrastructure that goes with hosting your applications and data. You're charged with their security, you're charged with the internet access, you're charged with the maintenance of hardware, you're charged with the responsibility of literally securing. And as you know, when I talk infrastructure here, I mean issues around clean power, good backup systems, and also good high-speed internet connectivity. So when you do local hosting, you are charged with that responsibility. And so when you talk about scaling up, which the previous panel talked about, you have to think about how do you scale up your resources to accommodate your growth or scaling. So that's where I see a big difference between local and cloud hosting. But otherwise, I mean, I think my colleagues have very clearly described the differences. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. I think that puts us now on the same page. And so far, we've been discussing a lot of integration of efforts between digital public services, for example. And that comes with a lot of data. And when we are thinking about health data, that is sensitive information. And if we are talking about integration, that is massive information that is, shared together. And I think one of the key questions that came up in the morning also was distributed use, because if we are going to empower community health workers, for example, to use the information, that means there's a lot of distributed use. So before we continue with the panel, then I'd like to take a quick poll and ask and know who is pro cloud and who is pro in-premise. Just a quick poll by a show of hands. I'm sure there'll be middle grounds. So let's start with on the cloud. Okay, that is on about 20, well, maybe 15. So that was on the cloud. In-premise, slightly less, I think, if I'm not biased. It depends. It depends. We have a fourth option, hybrid. Okay, all right. Let's see if that changes at the end. So the first important question then, I think that I'd like us to engage with is, what are the trends so far in the continent that you're seeing on the continent on local versus cloud hosting? And what are the challenges and the benefits that are driving these trends?
I'm going to pass this to my colleagues here because, that's not my area of expertise yet.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I think we have noticed that there's a lot of technological improvements that are happening on the continent. We have also seen growth in infrastructure and setting up of data centers by some of the major players. My colleague already mentioned the likes of Microsoft, Huawei, AWS that are setting up data centers in Africa. And what that means is we are now able to have these data centers close to the countries, and that reduces also the latency when you want to access your information. And also, Africa is also benefiting from increased connectivity, increased bandwidth. There have been fiber cables that have been laid now into Africa, which also means that you can easily and quickly access your information that's hosted in the cloud. So these are some of the trends, but I would also want to speak to technological skill sets that are being built, actually even by this institute. The universities are training a lot of Africans who can actually support and be employed by these major players to man and support their infrastructure. Suffice to say, this is not at large scale. There are few countries that are benefiting from this kind of interventions. We talk about South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, that are benefiting from this establishment of data centers. But when you look at the low-income countries, they're still struggling to set up this kind of infrastructure, and that comes as a bottleneck. So maybe I'll stop there, and my colleague can come in.
Yeah, maybe one of the things that as different countries are developing their own strategic plans, some of them are 5 years, some of the 10-year strategic plans, and thinking about investment in infrastructure, because that's how I look at decisions between cloud-based and on-premise hosting. And as you think about that, you think about things like scalability, and many governments are increasingly digitizing their services. As we've had, the case of Sierra Leone from the minister this morning, and even from yesterday's conversations, we know increasingly there's people are realizing the benefits of cloud-based hosting, especially as we go into large-scale digitalization of government services. And even, so one of the things about the economies of scales, I think countries are realizing that it's more cost-effective to invest in the cloud as opposed to building your own data centers, because data centers are quite expensive. They're pretty pricey to build. So, but it's a long-term investment. So looking at that to make those decisions. And just maybe to start off with some of the challenges I see. And some of them were mentioned yesterday, issues around regulation and policy, that we just don't have adequate, many countries don't have adequate legislation and policies and guidelines to guide issues around data security, especially when it's hosted remotely on the cloud. So that's like one of the major challenges. So policies catching up with practice. for many countries. And then issues around organizational and cultural change, because we are coming from a tradition where we were used to seeing your physical servers sitting on premise, and people thought that was the most secure way to secure your data and apps, but it may not necessarily be the case, because you can be hacked. I mean, if you have on-premise hosting, but it's not secure, then you're still very exposed. So I see that as a major challenge, which kind of having that organizational and cultural shift towards thinking cloud-based hosting.
All that emotional satisfaction.
Right, exactly, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and again, like I mentioned, I mean, one of the other benefits is just scalability. When you host in the cloud, you scale based on how your data and programs are growing. So I think it gives you a bit more flexibility and more agility. And then one final one, which I would mention, and I would use an example from where I work. Like I mentioned, I mean, we work with the Rwandan government to implement the Rwanda Health Information Exchange as one of our big projects. And one of the components is on electronic medical records. And so the plan is to move electronic medical records to the cloud for one main reason, for continuity of care. And again, going back to Dr. Dembi's presentation this morning about patient-centered approach, such that if we know that people move around, when you are treated at facility A, and then you want to move with your records to your different facilities so that you have continuity of your care. And so hosting in a way that allows you to move with your data is, again, one of the key benefits. And issues around you can implement policies uniformly, like security of the data and all other policies governing that data. So my general feeling is that there's a positive trend and a general growth of cloud-based computing, and people are slowly beginning to understand. And I think the myths around kind of losing control of your data are kind of getting debunked. And yeah, the general trend is a positive trend towards cloud-based hosting. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe I'd like to hear a little from the audience. Are we noticing any shifts in that space among any of you that has worked with data in terms of digital public goods in healthcare? What trends are you seeing? What are we seeing? I see a hand right at the back. Do we have a roaming mic? Let me give you this.
All right, thanks everyone. This is a great presentation. So I have a comment about this. It's more of it's not a question, it's more comments. I think when we think about data and hosting, the biggest issue is data sovereignty is not necessarily where the server physically sits. So I'm all for having these infrastructures coming to Africa. They absolutely should. There's no reason why they should all be based in certain countries, and for us not to be able to have those servers and infrastructures in country. However, I think it's going to be very impractical to expect that type of complex infrastructure to be locally hosted in every single country. We just have to come to that realization. And here's the reason for that. It's not actually the physical server per se, but it's actually the human resources, and specifically now we're in this meeting with Scilab, security is a big issue with it, right? So just because you've got the server in your quote-unquote backyard, it does not necessarily mean secure. In fact, I believe, this is my personal view, that in most cases, what the cloud provides you is a much higher level of security that you can guarantee hosting it locally in your back office system. So I think you really have to look at it from that perspective. And I think all of us in this space have to do a much better job communicating this to leadership, because a lot of government leaders tend to believe that physical server sitting in a basement somewhere is a lot more secure and provides that level of security that they have. Another point is, just because you have the data on your server does not mean it's not being compromised, right? Somebody can just copy it and can go anywhere else. So I think the question is, how do we bring that to the region? Maybe it may not necessarily have to be in every country, but we can take advantage of, say, the economic regional blocks to take advantage of building this infrastructure for the continent.
You actually helped to segue into the next question. So I think I will ask it, and then we shall engage right after the panel has a chance, and then we can come back to that question on security, because I think one of the perceived benefits of on-premise has been the control, the perceived control, and the perceived security. And so I think the question that I'd like to pose to the panel and then come back to the audience is, what are the main security and privacy challenges of hosting on the cloud versus on-premise?
So I agree with Al there, and I also, when you talk about, the words perceived, right? And it is the case that I have seen. Security is a very, tricky topic and a deep one, and having security experts in every single, like imagine if CMU has, in this building, has its own data, and you need to have those experts, like Tom said, you need to have, good connectivity, you need to have, very good air conditioning, right? And imagine when countries are on the journey, and like we've been talking about digital, right, and for health as well, right? So there is I think a trade-off that we need to make about the data being residing in the country and within the Ministry of Health, versus the data, whether it is really secure when it is in the country, or is it really secure when it is in the cloud. And those resources, like even Tom mentioned and Al mentioned, the reliability, the security, the cost effectiveness of data residing in the cloud, I would argue, is much stronger than when it is on the premise. We've had several instances, even in our country, where, data has been stolen, on-prem data has been stolen. So these services provide a lot more stricter rules. They are available for you. They give you tools that you can use to secure your data. There is also another part about the software itself being secure, which was talked about, yesterday as well. Are we encrypting the data and all of that? That's a part of the DPGs itself, and that's part of, setting down those guidelines for the DPGs to ensure that data is secure and private. But I would argue that there is much more reliability and security in cloud hosting rather than on-premise.
Yeah, I think from the government bodies, there are three main concerns that that comes to them when it comes to issues of hosting in the cloud. And one of them is data ownership. The other one is data availability, and the other one is data integrity. So there's a notion that once we release our data and it's in the cloud, then we lose ownership. And then there's the issue of once we put the data on the cloud, then we can also lose access to it. And this, I'll explain, is mainly linked to whether you have stable connectivity or not. And this is not always the case across Africa. You have some instances where, for example, if you're working with health information systems, you want the data in real time. If you want to access patient records, you want it to access it in real time. So there's always a concern that if we don't have robust infrastructure, if we don't have the right connectivity, then loss to information could actually happen. When you need the information, you can't actually get it. So those are some of the concerns that are there. From a security point of view, there are so many mechanisms that are put in place to ensure that the data still remains secure. As my colleague has mentioned here, encryption is one of them. So putting in encryption and ensuring that when you want to access the data, you put in, for example, two-way multi-factor authentication is one way that you ensure that you are creating secure way to access the data. And the other element, I would think, there has to be policies and governance, set of rules that all the stakeholders involved should agree to, right? So if there are issues of privacy, the team that's hosting the data should comply to this, should also agree to what the policies for that government are. But at the end of the day, I think we also need to understand which type of data that we want to host in the cloud. My colleague had pointed out the issue of hybrid approach. There's some personal level patient records, for example, that you would actually have it on a local server, and then the transaction records could actually be hosted in the cloud. So those are some of the design decisions that we need to factor in, and when we engage with the government bodies, that's the kind of advice that we also give them. But at the end of the day, when we look at scalability, reliability, it's always safe to host your data in the cloud, and you gain much advantage by doing so.
Before we come to Tom on that same question of privacy and security, I'm hearing one persistent factor coming up, which is infrastructure, lack of infrastructure. And how does that play out in the continent then if we are going for pro-cloud with a lack of infrastructure? How does that affect the continent, and how does that just play out generally? So I'll come back to that with the audience and maybe with the panelists as well. But Tom, you can go on privacy and security.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll just add to what my colleagues have said. So I think the first thing is about data sovereignty, which the gentleman just talked about very clearly. The question is, when you talk about data sovereignty, because like we had yesterday, there's countries that indicate that any of their public data should not be hosted outside the country unless there's guarantees that the third country that's hosting their data has better or similar comparable standards of data security and privacy. So that's, I think, one major consideration about making decisions whether to put data in the cloud. And then secondly is about jurisdiction. Because if you host your country, your data in a third country, there's varying jurisdictions, and how do you ensure that there's issues around remedies for breaches in security? How do you ensure that there's consequences for breaches of security? And stuff like that when you're dealing with a different jurisdiction. So that's something I see as a major challenge when thinking about hosting data in the cloud. And then the other one is just about kind of data governance, issues around how we collect data, how we transmit it. And I think he talked about encryption of data before it's transmitted. And then issues around destruction of data, because there's cases where we collect data, but then it's got a lifespan. And at some point, maybe like research data, for example, that at some point you've got to, destroy it. Maybe it could be 10 years or depending on the protocol. So things like that are things to consider and how well we can enforce them. So for me, it's actually the implementation and enforcement side of things once we have those policies and legislations in place, and just thinking across jurisdictions. Yeah, thanks.
I'm posing many questions, I think, to reflect on, but I want to come back to the audience again on this issue of privacy and security. There has been a view that it's challenging to reach certain levels of compliance with on-cloud. For example, when we think about HIPAA and when we think about GDPR, so there's that perception that on the cloud, it's difficult to reach certain levels of compliance with data protection. And then the lawyers in the room, Melissa, the question on litigation, especially when we come back to jurisdiction and different laws and regulations and policies. What is the issue? I mean, what do we need to think about when it comes to litigation when we are thinking on the issue of on the cloud versus on-premise? So I don't know if Melissa wants to start, and then I will come back to the audience.
Thank you. Hi. Well, when you ask a question that is based on litigation, then the answer is always it depends. But on a general scale, I need probably to expound on the question. When you're talking about litigation arising from data on a cloud system, are we assuming that breach has occurred? And then this is of sensitive personal data. Then we have to start by looking at the data protection law of the country that is the data controller or data processor, right? Because they would have a regulator, we hope, hopefully there's a regulator, an active one, who is monitoring what's going on with the sensitive personal data. And once there's a risk that has occurred, then there are mechanisms that kick in depending on the particular regulations. So that's not even a litigation step. That's just compliance with regards to the data protection law. Now, when it comes to litigation, who am I acting for? The processor, the controller, or the people whose data has been quote unquote breached? And in that case, they would still have to go back to the regulator. You always start with the regulator to file a complaint, and then the regulator will investigate. And depending on that investigation, you can also now go into civil remedies. Now, the cloud, this is me as a lawyer asking, what is a cloud? Is it a particular place? Is it several places? And then now that's me starting to charge by the hour.
We see. So we need to go to Melissa to find out this. I see a hand behind there, and then I just was told that time is almost running up. I think they stole our 40 minutes. I'm not sure how that happened.
Hi, thanks for the great discussion. One thing that strikes me is, compliance is really a shortcut for, and to try to standardize an approach for managing risk and preventing harm, ultimately. So if you're thinking about, are we compliant with HIPAA or not, that really comes into play when you're trying to seek a remedy after something's happened, once the harm has already occurred. So I think it's often useful to think about what's the threat model, and how do you manage that risk and prevent harm that way. So if it's citizens' health data and the threat model is nation state, I mean, is it, yes, if you're, on Amazon in the US, the US government could, have a secret court order and get access to that data, but if it's on-prem in the basement of a Ministry of Health, that's probably easier for a nation state to obtain than something that has the, physical protections that, cloud providers, facilities have, and the redundancies.
Thanks. I think Pradipta?
I think these are not easy choices, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't start, but the solution to that is not that we will not take use of the technologies that are available, which are on the cloud. But I agree that we should do a threat model that the countries should decide, and us as technologists and partners should help the countries evaluate, understand, build the guidelines and the regulations to protect the citizen and the data of the country. But, I think this is going to happen. So I think this is something that we need to be deliberately and thinking about and planning for it.
So we don't run way over time. I think what I'll do is do a roundup of comments, or rather responses from the panelists, and then perhaps end it there. And maybe as we finish up this, I wouldn't like us to go without answering the question, who's to decide? Because it may not be, I don't know, a one-size-fits-all. So who's to decide, and what can implementers do to make this tension between on-cloud versus in-premise much easier to navigate? So we'll round up with that set of questions.
So I think the first one is very profound, and that's a very important one. And I think the countries, as the custodians for the citizens or you can say that in terms of the citizen having the right to decide, right? And that's a philosophical question. I don't think I really can answer that question, or maybe I don't know if we can all answer that question. The second one is much simpler to answer because, like as technology providers, I think we should not go one way or the other. We should have all options available, and that's not a difficult thing to do, but not be tied to a particular option. Like in our case, we make sure that our software can be deployed on-prem, on the cloud, on a particular, Amazon, Microsoft. We don't differentiate. So that is something that technologists can ensure, and we can make our data secure through the other means within the software itself. So that's the easier part to solve.
Yeah, thanks. I think ultimately, the biggest consumer of the digital public goods would be the governments, because they're the ones in control of the solutions, and they collect huge data sets. So essentially, they're the ones that will decide. But our role is to guide them in terms of what is the right way to do things. And I think this will call for continuous engagement between the technology vendors as well as the governments, to really look at what is their problem, what is it that they're trying to address. We can't say go and host locally when the application needs to respond to scalability. If we are talking about digital public goods, there will be growth in terms of user base. How do you react to that? So definitely we need to direct them and show them that if you're going to host in the cloud, you get these advantages. But at the end of the day, they are the ones who have to decide and also guide on which data they would want to host locally and which data they would be willing to host in the cloud.
So please wrap this up for us.
Right. So just similar to what you said, I think for me, first of all, it's a very objective assessment of what the country needs are and what the capabilities are, because it's really a balance between your needs and your capabilities, and being sure that the investment is well informed, like you said, based on the pros and cons. Because I wouldn't say there's a one size fits all. I mean, there's something that fits every situation, but with the best evidence of what's the ideal direction based on the country's needs and capabilities. And then my second one, which is built on, trust, which I think we talked a lot about that yesterday, in terms of how do the DPG developers, the engagement as countries think about this local versus on-premise versus cloud-based hosting. And then if you allow me to just add one last thing, because I know we're out of time. So as I mentioned, one of my other roles is with Helena, and Helena works closely with other global advocacy groups, and there's been a push for the establishment of global health data governance principles that are around the rights-based and ensure equity of healthcare distribution towards the achievement of universal health coverage. So one of the push is for next year during the World Health Assembly to introduce a motion on the establishment of a global framework for health data governance that really talks about equity and just protection of human data and populations. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as I end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, Fidelis, and Pradipta. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.